We've had a great morning with interesting speakers this morning, and we hope to repeat the same this afternoon. So thank you for coming. We're glad you're here. We have two presenters for session three of the conference today. I'll introduce them both. The first speaker is Dr. Leilah Lyons, who has a faculty appointment at the University of Illinois at Chicago in computer science, and also has a position as Director of Digital Learning at the New York Hall of Science. So maybe one of the questions we have is how you maintain a faculty appointment in Chicago and serve as a director at a museum in New York at the same time. Gives me a special pleasure to welcome Leilah back here to the University of Michigan campus. She is a graduate of the College of Engineering here at the university. She was also a student in the first cohort of the Museum Studies program back in fall of 2003. Please help me welcome Leilah Lyons.
Thank you all so much. I just have to say how thrilled I am to be back on my old stomping grounds. Does that sound very strange to you? Is that better? And how often do you get to do an academic talk and be able to say, look, Ma, I did good? All right. So today what I'll be talking to you about is the challenge of exhibiting data in museums. And I'll talk through a couple of different cases of my own work where I have tried to tackle this challenge through the means of embodied interaction designs, and I'll explain what that is in just a little bit. Before I get into what I'm doing now, though, I'd like to talk a little bit about what museums do in general and what they have done in the past. We've had a long tradition of informal science institutions, especially in this country, dating back to Victorian era, and the purpose that they served at that time is somewhat different from the purpose that modern informal science institutions serve. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of context here. So, back in the day, they were actually places of active research. So researchers worked in museums, and the exhibition galleries were places where visitors could come into contact with the material culture of emerging science, so current science, new findings. And this would be evident to them in a couple of ways. I mean, obviously there were products of science, these artifacts, these taxidermied animals, these reconstructed skeletons, what have you. But there's also a certain residue of the science practice in these exhibits as well, just by virtue of the way that the artifacts were presented to visitors. So you'd see these birds, for example, arranged in interesting hierarchical orders that would convey some sense of what the thought processes were of the scientists who put them together. Now, more modern informal science institutions are a bit different. There's a bit of a sea change in the middle of the 1900s when institutions like the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia and the Exploratorium in San Francisco, a little bit later in the 60s, started to realize that more traditional means of exhibition were harder for novice learners to access. You'd have children come into museums and they would read these incredibly dense labels. So what they recognized was that they needed to take a different approach. And what emerged from that is that museums began, especially informal science institutions, began emphasizing more of the process of science. So they were interested in presenting, getting visitors into contact with more of the process of science. So less the product and more of the kinds of activities like inquiry learning, being able to pose and answer hypotheses, things of that nature. Now, this has clear benefits for kids, but you lose something with that as well. The material culture of science is lost. We don't come into contact anymore with the stuff of emerging science. In some ways, modern informal science institution visitors are even more insulated from emerging science than their Victorian counterparts were hundreds of years ago, which is kind of an odd thing. And so what I'm interested in, so I have a background in computer science, and I'm often, asked, well, what do you think the future of museums is? We've had a lot of talks today, for example, talking about the ways in which museums can extend their reach digitally and virtually outside of their walls, but I'm actually very interested in what happens inside these edifices that we have in place. And one of the questions that I've been confronting in my own work is if we can put back some of the material culture of emerging science into these institutions. Can we bring back some of what we lost? And I think that this is important because it helps learners envision themselves as scientists. They get a better sense of what science careers are like, what it involves, and that is only good for us as a society to get kids into the fields, the STEM fields in particular. But this is the problem with emerging science. This is the artifact of today. Lots and lots of data. And there are some issues with making this engaging for learners, as you might imagine. So just to give you a brief overview of the nature of this culture clash between the culture of science and the culture of museums, I listed a couple of important contrasts between how scientists interact with data and how visitors expect to interact with exhibits, how we've trained them to expect exhibits to behave in response to them. So scientists, for example, it's typically one person who's interacting with the data, whereas in museums, people are almost always in social groups, whether it's friend groups or family groups or school groups. A scientist will spend a long amount of time interacting with his or her data, hours, days, months, years even, whereas visitors typically expect to spend just a few minutes at a given exhibit. In fact, a lot of studies have shown in informal science institutions with interactive exhibits, it's somewhere between 2 and 4 minutes. That's not very much time. Scientists bring a lot of deep prior content knowledge to their interactions with data. They know what it is they're looking at and looking for, whereas visitors, you can't assume anything about their prior content knowledge. Sometimes you get the kid who has the island of expertise who really knows a lot about dinosaurs, but that's not the average visitor. Also, scientists are familiar with the representational conventions used for the data set that she or he is working with. So they know something about how the data is being represented. They know what that representational scheme means. They know how to translate it, decipher it, make sense of it. You can't assume that about visitors either. I have been surprised in my work to discover how many grown adults struggle with simple line graphs and bar graphs, for example. And finally, the scientist is familiar with the types of actions that are needed to explore this data set. It's not that you just plunk yourself in front of a computer and stare at it. There are a series of operations and sequences that you engage in when you're trying to make sense of a large collection of data. And visitors often have no grounding in this whatsoever. So, looking at these contrasts, you can see that when you think about how you would exhibit modern material culture of science, there are some real challenges. We can't do this. This is not going to be an exhibit that's going to be typically successful. I don't know, how many of you have used SPSS? It's really common in social statistics. Yeah, so we need to think a little bit more broadly about how we can bring these cultures together in a more appropriate way. So a natural question that people often have is, well, what about data visualizations? Pictures are worth 1,000 words, aren't they? We could just show them these lovely renderings of all this data we have, and people will awe at it, and they'll come away knowing something about genetics or climate change or the history of science. Unfortunately for novices, that just really isn't the case. I was having a conversation at lunch with someone, and I mentioned that we're in this problem space where our ability to produce visualizations has far outpaced our ability to help people understand them and make sense of them. We're inventing new representations of how to decipher. And here are some of the known challenges with making sense of information visualizations. A couple of these are in sequence. So for example, the very base level, you just have to be able to decode the representation itself. Novices typically have a really hard time connecting what is the representation is showing with what is being represented. Even if a learner can do that, if they understand what a scatter graph is, for example, they still might struggle with interpreting what that means because they don't have that deep content familiarity that scientists do. They can see a pattern in the data, they can see that something is increasing over time, but what does that really mean to them? And then we come to two other issues with novices making sense of visualizations that are particularly important for museums. The idea of motivation. So museums are free choice learning environments. We cannot compel anyone to sit down and stare at data until they get it. They're going to walk away if they lose interest, or if they don't, they're not even going to stop if they don't have interest in the first place. We need to promote motivation to help sustain the decoding and the interpreting work, because let's not fool ourselves, it is work. Looking at a visualization is very different than looking at a picture. And then finally, there's this challenge of placing all of this in a social context. So you've got groups of people in this setting, they know each other, they're interacting with each other. A lot of times when visitors come to museums, they're looking for that. That's one of the main things that people say that they enjoy about their museum visits. It gives them a chance to interact with their friends, their peers, their loved ones. And so, how you can make these sorts of visualizations accessible to informal learners is quite a bit of a challenge because of these four things. Now, we're not lost in the woods. There's been a lot of research, particularly in formal educational settings like schools, exploring how we can get kids to better make sense. And you'll notice I often switch between saying visitors and kids. A lot of informal science institutions, the average age of a visitor is around 12 or so. So most of my user base are quite young. But in any case, so from schools, we know a little something about thanks to the educational research done there, about how you can help novices make sense of data visualizations. And there are two strategies I'm highlighting in my talk today. There are many more out there, but these are the two that were most relevant to what I was trying to do. The first strategy is that of construction. And so what you see here is a teacher has placed a bunch of apple stickers on a chart. And it was just a really simple data collection thing where they asked the class what their favorite kind of apple is, because apparently in the United States, we only have green, yellow, and red apples. But anyways, it's a very simple way to start constructing data representations. They know what that means. Each one of those apples is labeled with a child's name, for example. So they know that there's a mapping between the data point and the data source. Now, that's obviously a very simple illustration, but there have been more complex examples too. You have instances of classes going out to their local stream, let's say, and collecting temperature data, turbidity data over a period of weeks or months, and then plotting that data. And because it's their data, they have some skin in the game, they have some investment in having collected it, they're motivated to want to see that be realized in this representational form, and they have the grounding experience to make sense of it. Another strategy that gets used, especially when what the educators are trying to do is introduce kids to exceedingly large data sets, is that of control. So what you see there on the lower right is an image from World Watcher. It was an application created a long time ago, probably it was in the 90s, I believe, at Northwestern. And what they were trying to do is get children to explore temperature and other climate data sources. And how they did that was they allowed the learner to have certain kinds, they strategically gave control over how the visualization was being rendered to the learners so that they would be able to explore things like banding of temperature and things like that. And through their interactive play, really, with this interface, they would come to understand what the logic behind the representational scheme was. So as I said, these have been tested, and there's some controversy as to how effective they are. They're all, if you ask any researcher, if any given strategy works, they'll say sometimes, maybe. You have to get the conditions right. But there are lots of questions when you start thinking about porting these strategies to informal learning settings, where so many of the situational and cultural and social facets are very different. So. With these two strategies, what I've done is gone back to the challenges I mentioned in understanding representations, and I've highlighted which one of these challenges really rises to the fore when you think about using this visualization interpretation strategy in an informal setting. So in the case of constructing visualizations, the real barrier you run up against is motivating interest. Because, unlike the stream example, unlike the apple example, the visitor isn't there long enough to really collect their own data or to get involved in a deep investigation question. You almost have to supply them with data. And why would they care about your data? Why would they ever want to manipulate or construct a representation of your data? That's a real problem. You have to motivate their personal interest in it somehow. And then with respect to the strategy of controlling visualizations as a means of helping people make sense of them, the real big problem you run into when you try to use this in an informal setting is thinking about how you're going to adapt it to the social context. I don't know how many of you have ever tried to share control with somebody. It doesn't work out typically very well, especially if you're trying to share control, say, with a sibling. Things happen that maybe are not the most productive. The interactions that happen are not productive for learning necessarily. And so, as an interaction designer, which is what I do, this is a big challenge because, you're basically faced with two choices. One would be, well, you give control to just one person. So you have one person who has all the power. They've got the trackball. Nobody else can do anything, and so they can sit around and watch, but that's just not very engaging or involving for them. It's not a great educational experience. Another strategy is to try to distribute control amongst people, but then you have that conflict happen where, well, but I was trying to do this and you messed me up, that kind of thing, which also not very productive for learning. So I mentioned I was an interaction designer, so a lot of times what I do is I try to look at these learning challenges and think through, is there a way that I can exploit human-computer interaction to try to resolve some of these learning challenges? And in my case, for both of these challenges, I was interested to see if I could use what's sometimes called embodied interaction or full body interaction as a means of getting over these humps. So for those of you who don't know what embodied interaction is, just put really broadly, it's an approach to human-computer interaction that takes into account, it's much more holistic. It takes into account the user's body, their perceptions, the whole context of where the user is placed in space. I mean, traditionally when we think about human-computer interaction, we're thinking about a screen and a mouse, right? And that could basically be anywhere. But when you think about things from an embodied interaction perspective, you think about the fact that there's a certain spacing between me and the lectern. There's a certain number of you in the audience, and you have a distance from me, things of that nature. And while it sounds like a really esoteric area, we actually have already, many of you have already seen and used embodied interaction interfaces. So the more famous ones, the Nintendo Wii, they make use of accelerometers and their little controllers that track how you're moving your arms. And then the Microsoft Kinect is a more recent version, which is a little bit more slick in that it's using infrared and visual light cameras to actually see where your body is in space, and it can track your gestures and movements in space. All right, so how am I using embodied interaction to solve these problems? Well, I'm going to talk through two different cases. One of them is situated at the Brookfield Zoo. In fact, the permanent installation of this exhibit is taking place right now, literally right now. And then the second case is a exhibit that is installed at the New York Hall of Science, but it's still experimental. We kind of keep it under lock and key because we keep evolving it. And in fact, my students are going out there to do another data collection run tomorrow. So these are very much things that are active projects. So for the Brookfield Zoo project, of course, nobody is an island. I do all of this work with a list of fantastic collaborators who are listed there. But what we were trying to do with this is tackle that challenge of getting people's interest up in data. We wanted them to construct a representation. We decided, well, how about we let them construct that representation with their bodies? So use their own movements in the space, collect data from those movements, and use that to generate data points. And we thought that this would be appropriate because of the natural curiosity people have about themselves and their physical performances, as well as the natural competitive impulses that children, and sad to say, especially parents, bring to performance opportunities for their children. So the data set that we really wanted to get them to understand, though, wasn't their movement data. It was actually climate change data. So there have been a number of studies that have looked into why climate change is such a hard topic for the general public. I don't know if you're aware, but as they have these great graphs of so how much information has been disseminated about climate change, and then how many people are concerned about climate change, and these lines cross. The more information that seems to be released, the less people seem to be concerned. And a number of folks, especially the American Psychological Association, commissioned studies to understand why. And they found a couple of reasons. One is that people just have a hard time with magnitude and rate of change. These are hard things for them to understand. When they're confronted with the idea that the climate will be warming 2 to 4 degrees centigrade, they don't really understand what that means. It doesn't sound like very much to them. They think about their own thermostat and how, why aren't things putting on sweaters or taking off sweaters? That's what we do at home. And then the other challenge there is the rate of this change. Exponentiality is really hard for people. We tend to be very linear in our thinking. We understand that things can increase, that next year the temperature will be more, but we have a really hard time with the idea that, and the year after that, it won't just be more or more and more, but it'll be more and more and more. So that curve is just very hard for people to understand, and they in turn have a hard time deciphering these representations. So what you're seeing here is what's called the hockey stick graph. It's one of the more famous representations of climate change data. So the other challenge, and this is one that you face with people who actually do understand this representational form. They might not struggle at all with magnitude and rate, but what they do struggle with is variability in the data set. So they'll look at a representation like this that shows this big variation and then the trend line, And they feel like they're being lied to, particularly if what you're seeing is variation across different sources of data. So you have disagreements between ice core data and tree ring data. Well, they feel like, well, goodness, the scientists are trying to pull one over on us. This variation, look at where this is, this trend, I don't believe it, I don't buy it. And that's a more pernicious problem because this tends to happen with more educated visitors. So what did we do? So we made a game. The game is called A Mile in My Paws. And I'll just take a moment to explain how it works, but first I have to give you a very important piece of background information. So there are some very brave biologists who somehow got grant money to go to the Arctic, tranquilize polar bears, put them inside custom-made treadmill devices with heart rate monitors and VOX sensors, and they measured how many calories these polar bears would burn while walking. And then they had a similar chamber, except it had jetted water in it, and they were measuring how many calories these polar bears burned while swimming. And it turns out that ratio is 1 to 2.6, walking to swimming. So they burn almost 3 times as many calories when swimming. And the reason why these very brave biologists, I would not have done this, but I'm so glad that they went out there and did this work. They were interested in this because they knew that as climate change progressed, sea ice extent was decreasing in the Arctic. And the sea ice extent is a really crucial part of the polar bear's lifestyle, if you will. It's how they hunt. Seals live in and under the sea ice. They have to traverse it to go from one food source to the next. And you may have seen the pictures of the really horribly skinny polar bears out there. The problem is they're basically starving to death. They're being asked to work too hard for their food. So we decided that what we would try to do is help visitors actually experience this. So what we did in our first version, actually, we made use of accelerometers, much like the Wii sensors, and pressure plates. But in later versions, we actually switched to the Kinect system because it's just a little bit more reliable. But what we have the visitors do is they put on furry gloves and furry slippers, which you see this young girl wearing here, and we asked them to traverse the same stretch of the Arctic across 3 different decades, in 1975 and in 2010. And in these cases, the maps that they were traversing were based on actual satellite data. And then in 2045, where we used climate model projections to render the relationship between sea ice and open water. And so what would happen is, as they played through these 3 decades, in 1975, the kid would mostly be walking. And when they get to 2010, they'd be swimming a little bit, but still walking. And then they got to 2045, and boy, were they swimming a lot. And what we had done to these gloves, they didn't know it, but we had actually done some work to figure out how much weight to put in the gloves, so that, we couldn't quite reproduce the 1 to 2.6 ratio, but it was certainly harder to do this than to do this. So they could feel that difference, that it started out pretty easy, got a little hard, and got a lot harder as they went through those 3 decades. But that's not all we did, because remember, what we're interested in here is helping them decode representations of data. So we have this, which is shown during the game. It's a live graph that's being generated from their activities. And what you see on the left is the map. And you see where they started, this is the blue dot, and where they are currently is the red dot. And then on the right-hand side, you see the calories burned moment to moment. And you notice that that line is comprised of 2 different slopes. You have a very shallow slope, for example, when they're traversing ice, when they're doing the walking motion. And then when they move into a puddle of water or a stretch of water, you see that slope change. And because this is being generated live, people can watch it. It's shown on both a large display in that space as well as on an iPad that the interpreters who are helping moderate the exhibit use and bring around to the visitors so that they can see what's going on. So it looks something like that. So you can see it being built in front of you. So that helps them make the connection between the difference between swimming and walking and calorie burns. But then the next step is after the game has been played, and it takes about 2 minutes, 3 minutes for a visitor to play the game, you get to see their data over time plotted along with the data of thousands of previous visitors. So we're really taking advantage of the scale of a museum educational opportunity, well, in this case, a zoo. But the fact that these informal science institutions are drawing thousands of daily visitors is a great thing for us when we want to illustrate, for example, issues of variability. So Brenda was the person who just played. There's the last player who used the exhibit. So you can see their data in contrast. And typically, when visitors use this, they are waiting to use the exhibit so they see what the last player had done. So for Brenda here, Yeah, it did seem like the last player was getting a little crazy when they were using the pause, whereas a little more relaxed. So that's probably why their calorie burn is a little bit higher for that decade. It helps them, very easily make the connection between variation. And it seemed natural, and they understand that it doesn't mean that the data is lying to them or is wrong. There just is a natural amount of variation whenever you're trying to measure a given thing. And it also illustrates this magnitude and rate issue, right? So there's a trend line that can be generated and that can be made to show, and the interpreter will summon this to start bridging to a discussion of the classic hockey stick graph. So they can talk about what exponential change is, they can talk about what it means for the polar bear, and the kid who played the game has this really rich physical experience where it makes sense to them because they felt it. Yeah, it was hard in 2045, those poor polar bears. So when you think about how well we address the challenges that I had pointed out as being endemic to helping novices understand data visualizations, there are a couple things we did right and a couple things we didn't do so great. The decoding the representation worked out very well. There didn't seem to be any problems with certainly the players understanding what was being depicted in those representations. People were really genuinely interested in it as well, which you don't normally see. If you try to show a graph to a visitor, normally run away, right? The other thing that worked really well is motivating the interest, right? So because it was their own data, they wanted to see how well they did, they wanted to see how well their sister did. The activity itself was really high energy and game-like. It drew crowds. We were really surprised because, honestly, as a game, it's not that fun. You're kind of doing this and doing this. It's, there's no strategy involved. But people really seemed to enjoy watching others do it, and that actually started posing a problem for us. So we had more people wanting to play the game than could play the game. If you think about the fact that part of the educational value of this experience is that felt experience, one of our interpreters came up with this great way of extending the activity beyond just that single user. So that's the girl in the blue who's wearing the fuzzy slippers and whatnot. You notice there are 3 kids arrayed behind her. She had the brainwave to say, I know, let's help her swim. So the kids standing behind the main activity child also started swimming, even though they weren't wearing gloves, and also started stomping. And what was cool about this is we actually found that improved their educational outcomes. So this is just a really simple exit survey question we asked people. So we observed a number of visitors. I think this was probably on the order of 60 or so that came through one of the days we were running it. And just asked them to vote. Did they think that swimming or walking was harder for the polar bear? And you notice on the far right there, those are all the spectator participants. And they kind of got it wrong more than you'd think. So the people who got it right, that's what the black bar indicates. But they had a harder time judging, and this is actually backed up by kinesiology research. It turns out that even experts, like coaches, are really hard at estimating the effort of others just by watching them, even though it turns out we're very good about estimating our own effort, incredibly accurate, actually. So I can tell you pretty precisely when I'm at the gym and I set the pace of my treadmill to be twice as hard, that feels twice as hard. We're good that way as self-reporters, but can't do it for other people. On the left-hand side, you see the players, and the players have a much higher response rate. They're doing better. They understand that swimming's harder. You get a couple kids who they were just so crazy with what they were doing. You had some kids who were stomping like that. So not all of them got it right. But then you look at the kids who are pantomiming, and statistically, their answers were more similar to the players than to the spectators. So it does show, first of all, that this embodied experience is really important for grounding their understanding of the phenomena. And it also suggests that we need, as designers, need to think about how we can extend these experiences to embrace a larger number of visitors. Because if you have, 4,000 people going through the exhibit, which we did in one day, and only 25 people played the game, we're not scaling up in quite the way we need to. Now for something completely different, this is the second case, where what we were trying to do was give visitors control over a data visualization. And in this project, the data set we were working with was a pre-existing data set. I like to call it the original gangster of data sets. It's US Census data. And what visitors do here is they control how this visualization is being rendered through their own body movements in the exhibit space. And if you'll recall, this control issue was the one that was particularly challenged by the social nature of the way people like to use and make use of exhibits. And so what we tried to do was capitalize on the natural interest people have in watching others. So we made it a performative experience so that you couldn't covertly control this visualization. You had to overtly control the simulation. There was no mystery as to what you were doing in the space. We parallelized the control, and I'll get to what that means in just a moment. And then we also situated the control in the exhibit space itself. So you'll notice these visitors are standing on a marked floor mat. That floor mat is part of the controller. So, we're taking normally we think about interaction as being in the screen. That's where we're putting our mouse pointer. We took that locus of interaction and put it on the floor. So again, it increases the visibility of what people are doing in this space. So let me give you just a quick tour of what the exhibit is, because it's kind of hard to understand it unless I explain. How it proceeds is a visitor approaches the exhibit. There's a kiosk outside where they get to fill out a simulacra of a US Census form. It's not the full form because that's ungodly long, but we've selected 4 or 5 questions that we think are good for piquing the curiosity of our visitors. Once they've customized a data subset that they're going to represent based on their answers, so you're asked questions like, what is your first ancestry? So I might mark something like Irish or German or what have you. What is the size of your household? Is it a 1-person, 2-person, 3-person, what have you, size household? How large is the building you live in? Which, this is, mind you, this is in New York City, so this is a pretty rich question that we get interesting answers to. Things of that nature. So you have a data subset then that's associated with your responses to these questions. And when you enter the space, what you do is you put a RFID, a radio frequency ID card on your neck, which uniquely identifies you to the exhibit. Now we're actually making use of the Microsoft Connect for this as well. It can track where people are in space, but it's not so great at uniquely identifying people, so that's why we have the dual sensing system set up. But in any case, when you enter the space, you see your data subset get visualized on the screen along with the data subsets of the people who are already present. So here we see 3 different data subsets. The kid with the red dot, he is, I believe, first ancestry is Mexican. The blue dot represents Polish first ancestry, and the yellow dot, I think, is Chinese first ancestry. And you can see that these are layered as scaled centroids, is what it's called, but we kind of call them bubbles because they look like bubbles on the map. And they can manipulate how that looks through their movements in the space. So I'll give you a closer view of what the screenshot looks like. So this is responses to how many people live in your household. There are 2 users present in this exhibit at the time. And so you can see a couple things here. You can see the spatial distribution of these households across New York. And you can also see on the bar graph the absolute numbers of people who responded, either single-person household or 5-person household. And how this is interactive, there are 2 different ways. We allow visitors to control what the year of their data set they're viewing is. So in this case, both people are standing on the timeline for 2000, and I'll show you a little bit more about that in a minute. But we're comparing 2000 data to 2000 data. And the other thing you can do is by jogging like slightly forward or slightly back, your data set gets prominence. So again, I said these sets are layered. Here what we're seeing is that the person who is representing 5-person households, the orange data is layered on top of the purple data. And so that gives people, they want to move forward and back just so that they can compare, so that the bubbles sort of, move front and back, on the z-axis in front of each other. And so it has a really nice dynamic effect. I probably should have showed you a video. It's hard to describe. Well, in any case, what we're trying to do here, we had reason to believe that we could design this to encourage interpretation. And we could do so by taking advantage of something called embodied cognition. So embodied cognition, the theory of embodied cognition basically says that we form a lot of our abstract understandings of the world around us via our very early physical explorations of that world. So we understand concepts like balance. There's this sort of tie between balance and making gestures like this because we have an embodied sense of what that concept means. And a common embodied metaphor related to time, remember we wanted people to control timelines, is the notion of going forward into the future or backwards into the past. And we thought that if we use this embodied metaphor as the crux of our design for controlling time in this space, it would encourage visitors to take a more personalized, a more first-person stance on their data set. So they would feel more identification with it, they would be more interested in it, they would be more invested in exploring it than if we used another control strategy. In this case, our control case, the horizontal control case, is much more like you would typically see, say in an interactive web app where the timeline is horizontal left to right, where the past is to the left and the future is to the right. And it turns out we were actually pretty darn right. I was really surprised with how well this worked. So what this is showing you, this is my data, this is showing the results of a dialogue coding that we did over 3 days of interaction with this exhibit, where half the visitors got the vertical condition, the other half got the horizontal condition. We went through their talk with each other. Now, mind you, they're alone in this exhibition space. There's nobody interfering with them. We didn't give them any fixed task. They're free to explore however they want. And you'll notice that the folks in the vertical condition, the blue line, much more likely to use first-person terminology when talking about their data than those folks who were in the horizontal condition. When I say first-person terminology, I mean things like, wow, look at that, I'm all over there, and look, you're way over there. So they're pointing out the spatial patterns. So maybe one visitor is more present in Manhattan and the other one's more present in Queens. But they are clearly associating the data set with the personages who are in the space. And you might wonder, well, why is that important? How does that help with data interpretation, as opposed to saying, look at those Malaysians over there, if you have the Malaysian data set picked? Well, it turns out that affects how they reason about the data. So we also coded what they said to each other, looking for statements that involved time interpretation, data set interpretation, spatial interpretation. So, reasoning about, how, whether there are changes across time or not, reasoning about the nature of the data set itself, reasoning about how those data sets were arrayed in space on the map. And again, you'll notice that the folks in the vertical condition, overall, they were much more engaged in interpreting this data set than those in the horizontal condition. That it was just very striking. And of course, that was certainly true about time, which you'd expect because they're embodying the time control in their body. But also just reasoning about the data set in general. They did a lot more of it. So recapping how well this exhibit did at facing these 4 challenges, this one worked a lot better across the board, if you will. The interactive manipulation really helped visitors understand what was being depicted. We saw a lot of shuffling forward and back and comparing, and they started talking through what they were seeing with each other. That interpretation piece was fantastic. We didn't see a lot of interpretation with the pause exhibit. The interpretation was actually something that the docents were doing. Whereas in this case, the visitors themselves were doing the interpretation, and that was really highly tied to this perspective-taking phenomena I mentioned. So it's really cool as an interaction designer, if you find out that you've created a design that makes people do things, that's pretty awesome. I'm promoting learning. I can claim this now. And it worked really well from a social perspective also, because they were sharing their data and comparing their data against each other. And the neat thing about this exhibit is that it changes depending on who's in the room. You get a completely different visualization each time, which is pretty neat. Now, all that said, the thing that didn't work so well, even though we had them personalizing their data sets, they didn't have really a deep interest in census data. I mean, these are 12, 13-year-old kids in a science museum in New York. Why would they care about census? I mean, we knew that going into it, but moving forward, we think what we're going to need to do is provide them with some interesting tasks or challenges to motivate them to dive a little deeper than just making those really simple surface interpretation comparisons. So, looking across these, what I was able to explore was that you can adapt some of these data interpretation strategies from formal to informal environments. Embodied interaction can be used to do that. It works well in certain respects. There's still some room for improvement, though. I mean, as I mentioned with the A Mile in My Paws exhibit, we need more docent assistance at interpreting the data set. They really need to be much more active about helping the visitors make the connections between their physically generated data and the actual scientific data. And some of that is just boils down to professional development for the interpreters. They had a hard time with doing that task. And so we're helping them with that, and we're also helping them by evolving the design of the iPad interpretation tool. There's still this issue of the social context. So when you have people constructing data sets through their physicality, you need to think about ways to scale it up. Pantomiming worked in our case, but it's not going to work for every exhibit. And then when it comes to the use of control strategies, you really need a starter task to get people diving a little bit more deeply into the data sets. If you're giving them a pre-existing data set, it's just hard to get people engaged with it in a meaningful way. So I wanted to end the talk, actually, with some questions for you. So I've been talking a lot about how you exhibit data, this notion of the artifactualization of data as an artifact that we are showing off in these informal science institutions. And I'm just curious, because I know a lot of you are coming from different disciplines. I'd just like you to think about what kinds of characteristics define the shape and the feel of the big data sets in your field? And what I mean by that is, data has a personality, right? I mean, it has different magnitudes, frequencies, temporal spacing, the spatial relationships that may or may not be present in it, how much variance is present, if there are hierarchies or subsets to your data. Every field has a really unique artifact and artifact structure. You think about the way we put attention towards presenting, say, vases in museums, and how carefully we have to light them and think about how they're framed and made available for visual inspection. How do we do this with data? That's my next question. How do we build these frames or these vitrines that are going to showcase data for visitors? I presented one method, this sort of kinesthetic method, but can we think about doing this orally? Can we think about doing it through temperature? What are the senses of the visitor? How are we going to enhance the appearance of this data? And then my final question for you is, what are other artifacts of modern science that we might be ignoring? So I started the talk by saying that we have built a barrier between visitors and the stuff of science. And I highlighted big data as one element of that stuff. But I bet there's other stuff out there, and I bet you, given your particular disciplinary foci, know a lot better than I do where some interesting veins to mine might be in that territory. So thank you very much for your attention. This has been a real pleasure.